Hello everyone. I got some trivia questions for you here today about Mr. Verghese. For the first question, where did he go to college? Nope. Yep. What size shirt?
He wears a lot. All right.
Next question. What sport did he win a state title for McQuaid in 2010? I'm sorry, I called. Okay, what size? I know.
You got a shirt.
I know. Somebody else. Well. Oh. Do I let somebody else answer?
Yeah, someone else answers.
Yes. Yes. Wow, so smart. What size? Small. Okay, last question. How many jugs did Mr. Verghese receive when he was a student?
0.
Nope. 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 John. Yep.
Greg.
What size? A small. Two.
Am I up?
Yeah, I watched it.
Huh? I have to what? Good morning, McQuaid Jesuit faculty, staff, and students. My name is Joe Reformat, and I'm excited to welcome you to Agape Latte 15. Come and see. Agape Latte is a national program that was created at Boston College with the intention of letting people share their amazing faith-based stories with other people in an informal setting. The title for Agape Latte comes from the Greek word for the selfless, sacrificial, unconditional love of God, agape. Our speaker this morning is Mr. Christian Verghese, S.J. A McQuaid alumnus, Mr. Verghese graduated in 2011 and attended Georgetown University to study mathematics. During his time at Georgetown, he contemplated his religious life, joining the Jesuits shortly after. He continued to pursue a master's degree in mathematics and now shares his talents back here at McQuaid, teaching math and theology. I've been lucky enough to have linear algebra with Mr. Verghese this year, and despite my extreme lack of understanding, he has made it one of my favorite classes I've taken at McQuaid. Sadly, he will be departing next year for Boston College, where he'll be taking his next steps in Jesuit formation. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Mr. Verghese.
Thank you, Joe. I wouldn't characterize your understanding as very lacking in linear algebra. Let's see if I have some water here. When Jesus turned to the two disciples and saw them following, he said to them, "What are you looking for?" They said to him, "Teacher, where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying, and they remained with him that day. Every year, our Jesuit province on the East Coast hosts these gatherings to help bring people together who are thinking about becoming Jesuits. So we call them vocation promotion or come and see events. The name come and see is straight from this gospel passage from John, where the disciples they went and saw where Jesus was staying. So vocation promoters like Sean Haggerty, who visited last fall, they run these come and see conferences. And they hold these social gatherings, they say mass, and they have a few sort of inspiring talks given by older Jesuits. And my first come and see event was at Fordham University during my senior year of college. So I took the megabus from Washington, D.C. up to New York, up to the Bronx. And I met for the first time Father Tom Smith, who Father Judge and Father Jack would know pretty well. Father Tom Smith was slated to give the first inspiring talk of the Come and See event. So he had been a priest at that point, this is in 2015, he had been a priest for 50 years. And when his talk begins, he starts to speak about the time he was first ordained a priest. He said the Gospel of John kept coming up at the daily masses and at the Sunday masses, and all the treatises of the Gospel of John were about love. So at this juncture in his young life, early on in his priesthood, he decides to preach about love, what it meant, how we're called to it, what God's love means for our lives. So after several rounds of homilies in this style, an elderly nun has had enough, and she approaches Father Smith. Father, she says, you've been a priest for less than a year. You're barely 30 years old. You're not married and have so little experience. Yet you continue to preach this way, she says. She pauses. Honestly, what do you know about love? Father Smith is struck speechless at this point, and certainly it's a lesson in humility, but it's a poignant, and I think it's a brilliant question. What do you know about love? For Father Tom Smith, it was a challenging question. What could you possibly know about the topic you're preaching about? Or how could you possibly talk authoritatively on love? But it's an invitational question. I imagine it's the same invitation that the disciples felt when they first saw Jesus and they came and saw where he was staying. God, after all, is love, and they wanted to see it firsthand. So most of what I've learned about love, that is to say, most of what I've learned about God, I learned from my family, my nuclear family, but also this McQuaid Jesuit family and my family of Jesuits. We've seen at this point 14 Agape Lattes, and I think we've come to know and to see the love of God radiated through our faculty's lives in these Agape Latte talks. In some ways, all 14 previous Agape Lattes, as beautiful as they are, could be summed up as a response to that very question. What do you know about love? So I learned one insight very recently on love from my 2-year-old nephew, Declan, last week. We were on spring break, and I had the opportunity to visit Declan in Philadelphia. Declan is an adorable bundle of joy. He was born in isolation, basically, in COVID. So I've appreciated and relished the very few visits that I've had with him. And one of the most striking things about my last visit with Declan was where Declan's eyes wandered. On my first morning in Philly, we traveled together in a back seat of a car to go to a farm. And I watched how rapidly his eyes were going back and forth. It was as if he was communicating just with his eyes, where do I look? Where should I focus my attention? Declan, in my mind, was facing the same problem that I face all the time. I could see the stress and strain in Declan's eyes as if they were fascinated by trying to take in everything all in at once. But we can't see everything at once. We really can see and focus on one thing at a time. So which thing? What do I focus on? And the general answer for me is I just focus on what I consider to be the most important thing at this very moment. For Declan, the most important thing on our car ride driving to the farm was trucks. And in part, I imagine it's because one of the few things that he could actually distinguish in any time and any place was trucks. So anything vaguely resembling a truck outside our window, he'd point out and yell abruptly and repeatedly, truck, blue truck, green truck. I realized over spring break that I'm very similar to my 2-year-old nephew. Not because I yell truck all the time out the car, but constantly I'm looking around like a child, trying to look for something to latch my eyes onto, looking for what I can understand, for what I can focus on, searching for where to look. So what do I know about love? What do I know about God? Well, what I know depends on what I see. And what I see depends on where I focus my attention and where I decide to stand and look. And I've been shown where to stand and look by my family. My brother and sister used to work at Saint's Place in Pittsford. It's an organization connected with St. Louis Parish. Some of you may know about it, that helps refugee resettlement. So I'd come along occasionally to volunteer with my brother and sister, and one of the most impressive and moving parts about Saint's Place happens when refugees first arrive to the United States. They get to the airport and almost immediately get sent to St. John of Rochester Church to what was called the clothing closet. I don't know if they still have it there. But here in the clothing closet, donations of all sorts and sizes, clothes, shoes, socks, belts, backpacks, anything you can donate that a person could wear would be sorted by size. That way, when a refugee family first arrives, usually with just the clothes on their back, they can start a new wardrobe in the United States. So one day, when my brother, Matt, was volunteering, family arrives to the clothing closet at St. John of Rochester. And the father of the family is looking for size 11 sneakers. Of course, it's the only size sneaker that the clothing closet does not have at the time. Well, my brother happens to be right there, and looking down at his shoes without hesitation, he takes the sneakers off his feet and hands them to the father. I get a little emotional about it because for those who know Matt, that's not just a one-off action. It sticks with people because that's just who he is. For when I needed clothing, the Lord says in Matthew 25, you clothed me. Matt set that example for me when I was at McQuaid, and I'm sure he will set the same example for his 2-year-old son, Declan, as he grows up and learns more and more to focus on things beyond blue and green trucks. But more than 15 years later after that event, I was attending an advancement event here in the STEM Center in the fall, and I was pulled by one of the donors over to this hallway. And the donor said, I was there when your brother donated those shoes, and I was so struck by his generosity. And I said, his generosity still moves me today. And I didn't know it at the time, but that very generosity, that example of service, was what was originally moving me to think about becoming a Jesuit. But I needed more prodding. I needed more encouragement. I needed something to point my direction and attention in that way. So the encouragement came in an unexpected fashion. A couple of years later, it started when I first got JUG, actually. My senior year, my second semester during choir class with Mr. Smith. What happened was Mr. Smith, he gave another student JUG for talking too much, and I, being a second semester senior, in all of my wisdom, because no one is more wise than a second semester senior, I know that Carl Codweiss does not deserve this JUG. So I intercept Carl before he leaves the choir classroom, and just before he gets to exit for the Dean of Students' office. So I give him a high five, I give him a hug, I shake his hand, and I say, Carl, I think you're an innocent man, and you don't deserve this. And without hesitation and with much justification, Mr. Smith immediately sends me to Dr. Parks' office as well for JUG. But then ironically, a couple of weeks later, Mrs. Dacey asks me to give a talk on character at the upcoming NHS induction ceremony. So during that speech, I talk mostly about my grandfather, who was a Methodist preacher, and his funeral happened to become right between that JUG and the NHS induction ceremony. So I give this speech, and the next day I'm called to the principal's office. And I figure, since it's during first period choir class, and it's with Mr. Smith, I'm like, alas, I figure Father Coughlin has to speak to me about my behavior in this particular class, and more specifically about the obvious discrepancy between me instructing about character and my very lack of it. So I started walking down that hallway from the choir room down to the principal's office, and it seemed like an eternal pilgrimage in the senior hallway. But I finally arrive, I knock on the door, and he and I sit down at the table in what is now Mr. Herschel's office, I believe. And we have some small talk, and I'm trying to discern where this conversation is going to redress my wrongdoing. But Father Coughlin throws me completely off guard. Christian, he says, do you pray? Not what I was expecting. Well, yes, Father, I go to Mass on Sundays. My mom and I occasionally pop into the morning Mass here in the chapel. What about baseball and volleyball? And in my mind, I was thinking, what about it? And he says, do you ever look at your playing these sports as prayer? When you enjoy that sport, when you see the talents that God has given you and you use them for the service of your teammates, that's communication with God. Come and see, Father Coughlin was essentially telling me, come and see the God who relishes in your joys and in your pastimes. That's prayer. So then he invited me at the end of that conversation to think about becoming a Jesuit. I didn't think it was a realistic option at the time. I wanted to have a family, I wanted to be a father, I wanted to fall in love, I wanted to be a husband. But he just said, I want you to consider it. Get a spiritual director in college, and think of this life not as a sacrifice, but as a source of joy. So Coughlin also happened to be instructing a small group of students, including me, in linear algebra at the time. And I would characterize my understanding as very lacking during that class. But what I saw in Father Coughlin's class confirmed what he told me in his office. Using all one's talents for God's service brings joy and purpose and abundance in life. That's prayer. So now, 8 years later, in Jesuit life, I'm back here teaching math with a small group of linear algebra students included, and I'm working in the Service and Justice Department, and I'm delighting in it. But we are not just a people of joy and sunshine. The church, Martin Luther King says, the church is a place for the brokenhearted. And what I know about love from the people who love most in my life is that they don't look away from darkness. They don't look away from pain. They're not looking for it, but when tragedy happens, they look it square in the eye, into the depths of darkness, and they find where love shines forth more brightly. So the last two stories I'd like to tell you are about brokenness and darkness, and I share them in part because they're tragic, yes, but I focus on them because we're an Easter people. We're people of hope. God doesn't look away from tragedy. God looks straight into it and sheds light on it. My siblings and I worked at a restaurant together, and my brother was a back waiter, my sister was a chef and a hostess, and I was a busboy and a dishwasher. And although it's somewhat of an upscale restaurant, every workplace has its tragic backstories among their employees, and this was certainly no exception. Our manager was at the heart of it. Her husband had taken his own life, and 8 years ago, her daughter, a good friend of Molly, Matt, and me, she took her own life as well. So our manager had walked in on both of those occasions and found them. And no one deserves to face such tragedy. We could only ask questions. So one day my sister goes to visit our manager, and she goes to her home, and they sit down in the living room, and the manager just starts crying. She says, "Molly, why would God let this happen to me?" Molly says, "I don't know why. But I know this. I'm here with you. I'm standing right here, and I love you." Where do you look for hope? Where do you look in the face of senseless tragedy? We could avoid those questions, but Molly doesn't shy away from that pain. She stands right there with her. I asked Molly about this encounter yesterday, and she said, "Standing with people in their suffering is so connected with joy. The people who have hurt the most, in my experience," she said, "are also the funniest, the most joy-filled, and the most tender-hearted people that I know." That's the God and the love that I've come to know. Our God who stands with the brokenhearted. The God who does not shy away from our pain, our questions, or our anxieties, but embraces them and embraces us. This brings me to the present day, at Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. And as you may remember, Father Greg Boyle came here a couple months ago to speak for Xavier Week. He talked about his experiences in founding Homeboy Industries, and then he also brought, as you might remember, Miles and King, who were both trainees at the time. Homeboy's sole purpose, he told us, is to help formerly gang-involved and incarcerated members of the LA community find healing, find meaning, and to find hope. So I had the opportunity to work there in LA with my sister a few summers ago. And it's ideal if those trainees who first walk into the door, those who are formerly incarcerated, those who are formerly gang-involved, it's ideal if those trainees at Homeboy excel so much that they can become leaders. They can help other first years navigate transitioning out of gang life, transitioning back into society, and transitioning out from prison. So that's exactly what Homeboy calls those trainees who become leaders. They call them navigators. And Kendrick is one of those people who came out from terrible circumstances in his life, and he became a navigator. Kendrick is an African-American, about 30-year-old African-American gang member in his early 30s. He was 9, though, when his mother entered into the living room while he was watching TV. She had intentionally harmed herself, harmed her wrists, and she said to him, "See what you made me do?" And at 14, Kendrick was jumped into a gang, and from the age of 17 on, he was raised into the prison systems. So sitting in G's office one day, Kendrick says, he's reduced to sobs, and he just says, "I realized, Father Greg, that I preferred my rage over my shame." But Kendrick transformed through Homeboy, and I witnessed part of that transformation while I was there that summer. He became a leader. He was a wounded healer who could have this incredible impact in connecting first-year trainees and witnessing and relating to them through his own past traumas. Later on, he admits, even before then, he had this preliminary interview when he first arrived at Homeboy, and they said, "Would you be all right working alongside people who you were shooting at, or people who were shooting at you?" He says later in an interview, he didn't know at the time, but the people that I'm taught to watch my back from, the people I'm taught are my gang rivals. These people end up being the most loving and the most welcoming people you come across, he says. Come and see, he says. Come and see the God who loves his enemies. This is not a story with a happy ending. Kendrick relapsed. He got back into drugs and got involved with gang life again. So this past Friday, on Good Friday, Kendrick was shot and was killed in his car outside of a grocery store in Los Angeles. Where do we look? Where do we look for hope in the face of senseless tragedy? Kendrick had a heart of gold, and that heart was shot on Friday. Molly and I sit as disciples, though, like the disciples on Holy Saturday, not in the pain of Good Friday or the unlimited joy of Easter Sunday, but somewhere in between, waiting, hoping, wanting to come and see him again. And I believe Kendrick is still with us. We cannot bring him back, and we cannot bring him back in the same way ever again, but God can. His spirit lives on in people like Miles and King, who we heard from in Xavier Week. They embody the same heart of gold, and by extension, his spirit lives on in us. So, what do I know about love? Where have I looked and come and seen God? I've come to Homeboy. I've seen Kendrick. I know Molly. I know Matt. I know Declan. I've come and seen and witnessed the love of God through them and through my families, both my nuclear ones, my Jesuit brothers, and this school community. The love of God who serves, who stands with the poor, with the refugee. The love of a God who delights in our talents and joys and offers us the opportunity to use them for his glory. The love of a God who stands with the brokenhearted and dies with us to bring us new life in the resurrection. So come and see, Jesus says. Come to me, and you will truly see. You will know what to focus on, and you will know where to look. You will know about who God is, and you will know what love is. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending today. Please join us for the final Agape Latte of the year by Mr. Baber on Monday, April 24th. If you're interested in learning more about Agape Latte, please see the little flyer on your seats about the Average to Excel program at Boston College. And thank you again, Mr. Verghese.